Morning, Woodie.
Hey, Sam, glad to be with you today.
I will introduce myself and then we can go ahead and introduce Woody. My name is Samantha Guerrero. I'm an urban planner by training. I got my master's in urban and regional planning from UCLA. And go ahead and introduce yourself, Woody.
And my name is Woody Tescher. I guess I said glad to be here with you today. I'm recently retired. Most recently the principal planner and urban designer for the Los Angeles office of PlaceWorks. Even though I said I'm retired, I'm continuing to. I will never divorce myself from planning, so I will continue to advise and provide input for their projects as they move forward.
Thank you so much for introducing yourself, Woody. I look forward to learning more about you throughout this interview today. I have 6 categories of questions broken down to guide our conversation today. The first one is career path. So tell me, what brought you to urban planning? How did you initially get introduced to the field of urban planning?
Interestingly enough, I didn't really start in planning. I started in architecture back in high school. One of my best friend's father was a really good architect, sort of a very traditional architecture style in the city of Pasadena, almost working in what we call modernism now, et cetera, in architecture. And I was blown away with that as well. So I applied to architecture school and went through what I would call traditional curricula of underground architects, which was never fun, never recommended necessarily all-nighters for people who are in that profession as well. And that's where I was for, again, that 5 years of that education. At the end of the career, the end of the educational cycle for me, I began to look at opportunities to think more broadly than just the building itself. I began to think about how places that are our community centers, our residential neighborhoods, our commercial districts, are a composite of many buildings and many uses, et cetera. It's a mixture of uses, a mixture of places, a mixture of experiences for people, places to live, places to work, et cetera. And so I was attracted to a graduate program that was being started at UCLA in urban design. And there was a requirement that those who are to be admitted to the program have a degree from an undergraduate school of architecture. But at the same time, our studios, which was really the core of the curricula, was being led by a full-time professor of architecture, as you could expect, but also a full-time professor of urban planning. Coupled with that, and which has had a profound impact on where I've gone in my career, it was truly a multidisciplinary program. What I mean by that is, in addition to architecture and planning, we had 1 day a week a professor from focusing on urban land economics. We had a professor from the engineering school focusing on transportation. We had a professor from sociology beginning to think about the human dimensions of the physical planning that we do in our communities. And we had a full-time professor of political sciences recognizing that, hey, politics ultimately can become important, especially looking to get plans approved, et cetera. So that's how I got involved in that. And very quickly, I will say that it led me to my first job, because one of my colleagues from graduate school was retained by a firm which was indeed a multidisciplinary corporation company. It was on the New York Stock Exchange for a while, et cetera. And they were retained by a client to develop a new town in California on the coast. It was going to be, 50, 60,000 people in the new town. But what it did, which rang the bell for me saying, this is the job you got to accept, was it brought together all those disciplines under one roof. So the planners had a role, the designers had a role, but we had the environmental sciences pulled into this, we had economics, et cetera, which is sort of essential about how we create places, is bringing those people together and learning how to talk to one another.
What are the most memorable projects that you have completed? What were their impacts?
Let me start, because I probably had 3 initial projects in those years that actually define where I've gone with my career, as also created, in effect, contributed to my reputation out there to be able to enable me to continue to advance the work that I've done over time, which has evolved over time, needless to say. And the first of those was revitalizing downtown Santa Monica, the 6 blocks of what is now the 3rd Street Promenade, which when we started that process was the 3rd Street Mall. In fact, we created and wrote something called the 3rd Street Mall Specific Plan, and it was dubbed Promenade at the conclusion of our effort as well. But what that was about, I think probably most people are familiar with this project, et cetera, was taking an area that was pretty derelict. I mean, it was sort of an initial incubator of homeless, if you will. That we know what the issues associated with that are today. But people were sleeping on the benches on the promenade at night. The businesses were 30 to 40% vacant, et cetera, or maybe even more so, et cetera. There was no life, no vitality in the area. We worked extensively with the community to basically define what is their vision for this area. They had had 5 earlier planning attempts to reinvent those blocks as well. All of them failed. None of them politically supported. None of them supported by the community. We had some, what I would consider to be some relatively innovative, hands-on, what I'll call people-oriented workshops that truly engage people, where we asked the folks who participated to play the role of the planner themselves. They moved buildings around in models that we had, et cetera, to make them a participant so that they had ownership of the outcome of that process as well. That was coupled by also understanding it wasn't just about the planning of the land uses, though this was one of the first areas in California that was designated for mixed-use development, et cetera. And so we were very conscious about how mixed-use developments creates that synergy, not just having commercial uses there to attract people to the other businesses there as well. So we provided opportunities for living as well as for commerce as well. And then we were also very conscious, because this was the mall, what had been a mall, pedestrian mall, to maintain and enhance that pedestrian activity. So how buildings were designed, how they focused upon the mall, how facades were transparent to invite people inside out. Those were all outcomes of this, which came back to me in many other aspects, and I'll mention some of these other projects quickly as well. But needless to say, the outcome was transformed. And it became a model throughout the United States. There were actually several books that were cited to this as the new planning of town centers, as the model throughout the United States. Now it's gone through an evolution since, another discussion. But it did. I think at the point in time is it had an incredible success. It was tied in with the city's retention of a economic development coordinator who was actually out there knocking on doors and inviting people to come to this place that is going to be an exciting center of the city of Santa Monica, coupled with the fact that previous to this time, there was never city council agreement. Different opinions about. We were able to actually get all members of the city council to have a consensus vision and view and indeed commitments to move forward on that. So that was the first project of some significance. That was followed up relatively quickly. We were retained to be the planners for the first general plan in the city of West Hollywood. And if you know West Hollywood, you know their first sort of objective was innovation and creativity. We don't want same old kind of plan that we've seen here in the past. So we actually, before the term was even, I think, commonly used, focused upon what we called sustainability. We talked about, it was about physical form, but it was about environment. It was about the economy of this community and a focus upon equity of this community too. The social programs were some of the hallmark within the nations themselves. And this was the first general plan, because the latter Santa Monica was not a general plan. This was the first general plan in the state of California, and it's received awards for this, that integrated those concepts, but also integrated the concepts of pedestrianism everywhere. And it was very focused. And if you pick up that general plan, where you're going to see a series of mini plans for many sub-areas of the city, and what you're going to see in that plan also is what their physical form is and how those projects in those places relate to the street and the street activity. We heard very early as we started the process that we hate the county codes and ordinances because they're really emphasizing the automobile. They're going to widen Santa Monica Boulevard and take away, what is a pedestrian space. So we said, your building has to be located along the street frontage. You park to the rear or underground, and the facade is transparent so that you can see in and out and have that penetration as well. What is really interesting that is even before the general plan is completed, we wrote an urgency amendment to the zoning ordinance to create this pedestrian district. After that was done, I had phone calls from the planning department of the city of New York saying, we've heard about how pedestrian-oriented the city is. How did you do it? I said, I will send you the copy of this one line in a zoning ordinance. Basically creates these standards about where buildings will be and where parkings will be. Needless to say, there was a lot more on that. It was also a city that really had bought into mixed use, affordable housing. Actually, housing and rents were one of the reasons the city incorporated originally to get out of the county so that they can actually make commitments to maintain housing that is affordable for the population. And there were also the human-related issues about this unique population. This was unlike any of the other cities probably had worked in terms of its demographic in many respects as well. You can see the results. I mean, we transformed Santa Monica Boulevard to double rows of trees. There's a real simple hand-drawn sketch that I did in the old document that looks like a child drew it, of double rows of trees along the sidewalks. We have plenty of samples of mixed-use buildings and some of the earliest mixed-use development in Southern California in particular. And that project, in turn, was then followed by the third one that I considered to be pivotal was the general plan framework for the city of Los Angeles. This started as something called the balanced growth elements of the general plan and was precipitated by the fact that they were expanding the sewage treatment plant at Hyperion, and the feds said we were not going to finance this, and now you just get serious about growth. So this went back to the centers concept, which was developed in the late 70s, that basically the fundamental philosophy was to focus growth in a series of centers that are transit connected throughout Los Angeles as well. Well, this grew upon that plan. This actually took those red bubbles that was a center and differentiated different great categories. Some of these may be neighborhood places, which are small and not terribly intense, but also pedestrian oriented. Some may be more regional serving. Some may be transit oriented. So it created the first time in the city's basically vocabulary of land use classifications, those that were really related to type of place, function, and role. And then also looked at the boulevards as being an opportunity, as we well know now, by some of the recent changes in state law, potential locations for housing, because not all these areas are going to be filled with commercial activity along the linear lengths of boulevards, and it was one of the first plans that did then state. What's interesting about this plan is this plan has persisted. It is still the underlying land use plan document for the city of Los Angeles, while they're focusing now on, if you will, other, community plan updates that are more community related, et cetera. Trust me, it needs to be revised, needs to be updated. City staff knows that, et cetera. Then a couple of others be able to move forward as well. After that, we took the general plan, I think, a step further with what I call the relationship between planning and urban design by creating the first general plan in the state of California that is what I call a Mary's land use in urban form. So we have categories in this city of Sacramento 2035 plan that we worked with in all fairness, another planning consultant firm. This was truly collaborative. And we actually created categories that are no longer the single family R1, R2, R3, or the commercial corridors there, but actually the categories in the plan are like neighborhood residential, or traditional residential, or indeed regional centers or transit districts, et cetera. So it's based upon placemaking concepts as well. And so for every category of use in that plan, you will see kind of the traditional, here's the kind of intended functional role, here are the kinds of uses you might have there, but they're also basically direction about the urban form, buildings related to the street, buildings, how they relate to one another together. So it married is we moved from there into form-based codes. This was a predecessor of what is now form-based codes and being implemented as form-based codes in California. And then one last project I'll just touch on because it was so radically different. And it was I was provided the opportunity in one of my shifts of jobs to be a project manager for the conceptual planning and then the following implementation and follow-up for the development of the new University of California at Merced. This was a radical change in my career. I hadn't worked on any educational projects, et cetera. And I think that's important for planners to understand being flexible and being adaptable and changing to what's happening out there in the world is very, very important. So I was able to work. We had 5 clients, including the University of California, and work on basically the overall conceptual planning for what this new campus would be. That it was not going to be a Irvine. It wasn't going to be an isolated wall university. It was going to follow the European models where town and gown are integrated, if you will, through each other. So it was about the university plus a community for 36,000 people and a true integration of those. University built, et cetera. The work was followed up by Skin Rollings and Merrill has done all the architecture, most of the architecture. But also what was important about that project, it led me to really understand sustainability from a different lens because we were very heavily involved actually with 2 Nobel laureates out of UC San Diego who important to them was this notion, we weren't even permitted to use the word sustainability. We had to use the term stewardship. Interestingly enough, the politics, and ultimately the University of California has adopted the sustainability principles system-wide. But it was an incredible opportunity to work on something that was about creating an educational campus. The community has not fully developed. That's the missing piece. The campus is developed, but also I look at the photographs of UCLA, I look at the photographs of Berkeley. They were originally in isolation and not connected. If you look at them now, they're part of a broader community.
I would like to share this quick anecdote about myself that ties into the 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica. Growing up, my dad would take us on the weekend to the west side, to the beach cities, and we would walk through 3rd Street Promenade, and that was my first introduction into the built environment and how certain communities look different from where I grew up in East Los Angeles, which was more urban, more low income compared to the more prominent affluent city like Santa Monica. And so being able to interview you and have that opportunity is really a full circle moment for me. So I just wanted to uplift that in this conversation and thank you for sharing that. Woody, you were somewhat of a trailblazer that worked on this project and really implemented newer strategies into planning. So thank you for sharing that.
I use the term trailblazer. I don't want this to sound like an ego statement. Each one of those efforts had a team of people. As I mentioned, multidisciplinary, but it was always the ability to interact with my colleague planners as well, who had the same professional, the same background that I had as well, to do the brainstorming, to do the creativity and the thinking as well. None of those projects would have been realized just by Woodie being there. And so I think that, trailblazer is, I help to have a role, and I was able to help nurture that role through the process as well. And I think that's important for planners who are going into the profession to understand those partnerships and those collaborations are going to be truly important. I mean, we're in this era now where we're shifting over to, for example, AI-generated pieces of work. And I don't find those necessarily to be terribly collaborative in many respects, and it's taken the collaboration away. I've had in our firm recently individuals who are happy to sit at their desk and to focus upon the understanding things through AI, et cetera, and move things forward and make recommendations without that human dimension, that conversation, for someone to sit there and challenge them and say, maybe that's not the right idea. Maybe we should think differently about this as well. So just did want to emphasize that about my, where I've gone, because I think there are some people who can become egoists, if you will, about what their outcomes have been. That's not me.
Thank you for highlighting the value of in-person collaboration with a team of planners, which is a stark difference from the trending debate on using artificial intelligence or AI in the field of urban planning and design.
Well, really quickly on AI, I teach a course at USC, and it's basically two different courses. One is called Smart Growth. It's got the longest title in the catalog: Smart Growth versus Urban Sprawl: Policy Debates and Solutions. Think about it as an intro to sustainability. Then I teach a course on general plans. I co-teach the Smart Growth class as well. But the last couple of classes, we've had a number of students, because we have an assignment for the students to actually take a real place, identify the sustainability issue, and then to focus on creating a plan for strategies and solutions to make it more sustainable over time. And each of the three E's on sustainability on the stool as well. And we have found in the last couple of years a couple of students, maybe not all out of the class, but 2 or 3 students each semester who have generated their document by AI. The university has strict policies on that, but we have also recognized that they're easy to detect because they are so what I call rote. I mean, if you could almost say, well, I went to the library and pulled the section out of a library document, and that's what they are, without real creativity or thinking or challenging their mindset. It's called that creativity, taking it the next step, and which I always can think as a planner needs to be prepared to have their mind open, to think out of the box, to be able to be creative and move forward, and hopefully have that intellectual curiosity to say, well, this is what I'm hearing over here or reading over here, but what more can I do to make it, implementable? Because the implementation is important.
From your perspective, how has the planning profession changed or evolved over the years?
It's evolved. Let me start with some of what are the most obvious and explicit. The tools the planners use have evolved substantially. When I started, and this is really showing my age, we used to create land use maps by Prismacolor pencils onto area maps of the city. You get in a car and you drive around the community and say, oh, that's commercial, that's housing, et cetera, and you would create those maps. GIS. Jack Dangerman. It was actually, there was some Genesis GIS before Jack Dangerman as reason. I knew Jack pretty well as well. Not name dropping, but I knew Jack, and we were one of the first, if you will, users of GIS in the practice that I had as well. So we've had tools that evolved, and now, as you mentioned, AI, visualization, 3D visualization, we find to be absolutely important if indeed we're working within communities who are, let's say, recently in Moore Park, absolutely fearful of density. This is a single-family residential community, so we use 3D imagery where we actually had people take an existing commercial center that was maybe 40% vacant, and actually showed how you could create a mixed-use place, how you could create actually pedestrianism and places for people within this, but not just in words, but actually being able to visualize. And our visualization techniques now are just pretty powerful. You're able to make it real, almost photorealistic. In Pasadena, we didn't want to be totally photorealistic because that's a city full of architects, and therefore design is an issue. So we really we had our folks come back and do hand sketches of what we were doing through the computer. But anyway, bottom line is I think our tools have changed a lot. But also I think, planners, I think a group of planners in the planning profession is also realizing that there are a number of significant issues that have surfaced out there that maybe were either taken for granted or not a lot paid attention to in the past. I mean, and maybe this gets onto some of the other questions you're going to ask as well in terms of current issues, but planners weren't confronted with climate change per se as a direct issue. Maybe there were some people isolated in the corners and certain closets somewhere who were thinking about it, but there weren't a lot. Housing was kind of taken for granted because that was housing was pretty affordable for a long, long time, especially in Southern California, et cetera, going back years. But planners, I think, are there are among planners those who are willing to think out of the box, to begin to embrace and begin to say, hey, these are really challenges. So let's sit down and be conscious about how we create strategies and responses to address these issues that have surfaced as well. So planning, as I said, I mean, the word sustainability in planning was 20 years ago was not a term. Placemaking wasn't a term of use, maybe 20, 25 years ago. These are all terms that have evolved, and I'm sure 10 years from now we'll be using other terms and other philosophies, et cetera. I think the notion also is that as we create and move in these directions of approaches to address these issues, we need to monitor ourselves. Are these being successful? Are these reading to the end? And I go back to, one of my favorite stories is to think back even when I was a way small kid. Planners back in the 50s and 60s, almost 80 years ago plus, now 40s, 70, 80 years ago, actually thought that the big solution to our urban centers was urban renewal projects, bulldozers places. Bunker Hill, downtown Los Angeles, had this great infrastructure of housing. The planners were wrong. And there were many cities where planners were, if you will, wrong. So as we then create strategies and move forward, we need to be able to assess and monitor how effective our strategies and our responses are, and then be prepared to reject those and move forward and do something else different, because they may not work. There have been more than one case where our planning strategies haven't worked.
From your experience working in the planning field, what do you believe is the value of a professional organization like the American Planning Association?
Okay, let me start with, I initially rejected everything that was APA because I still had that architecture roots in me. American Institute of Architects, Urban Land Institute, which I still find, by the way, recommend for planners to be moving in the profession. You need to be thinking about Urban Land Institute because they do some pretty incredible things. But APA, I have been actively involved in. I never played the role as an active, if you will, on any of the professional organization itself in terms of being a president or on the board of APA, et cetera. I focused on California Planning Roundtable, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But APA itself has always been two primary areas for me as a private consultant. It may differ if you're in the public sector. One, private sector, want to be involved in APA for networking, because it has been a tremendous source for me for getting to know individuals or places have become clients on my list as well. Partly that's exposure, because I make it usually almost a mandatory part of my life at a conference to do a presentation, be involved in a panel or something that says, so have that visibility. It's APA. So as a practicing professional, joining APA for the networking, et cetera, is really important. Secondly, but ultimately probably more important for planners, is the learning experience, being exposed to what other communities are doing to address some of these issues that we talked about, our housing environment, et cetera, et cetera. It is a place, it's a source of information saying, well, what are you doing about this? After Third Street Promenade, I cannot believe how many other planners from other cities came up to me and asked me, well, how did you make this work in Santa Monica? They wanted to learn those lessons. We're really struggling with this particular issue and making our downtown work. So it becomes a means of exchange of information as well. Offshoot of APA, California Planning Roundtable, for those who may not know, is an organization that was created to be, quote, the brain trust of APA. It was created by individuals who found that APA itself was not structured at that particular point in time to address a lot of the hot button issues that planners were faced. So the intent was to create a research organization as well as outcomes and products that would be useful to planners to move forward. California Planning Roundtable, one of its very famous outcomes and documents, was called The Myths and Facts of Housing, which was to address the whole issue of affordable housing and density in communities. If you go to HCD, it's still being used, and they still publish it for us, if you will, et cetera. So it's an organization that's composed 50% of private consultants like me and public sector people like Vince Bertoni, planning director of LA, is on it. And it's split Northern California and Southern California. So it covers the entire state of California. Plus we have a couple of academic people on it as well. But we've actually grown and evolved over time to have multiple projects that we participate, everything from, if you will, sessions that we are now doing that are basically tutorials for planners to learn about planning, et cetera, to actually creating tacklets like one of our most recent papers and research was on what we call infrastructure for infill, recognizing that one of the big issues about infill that we keep talking about, creating pedestrian places, is the aging infill that is already there when you're infilling in an existing urban environment doesn't have the capacity to accommodate the sewer, the water, or the traffic of indeed what you're proposing, because you're intensifying use within those areas. So we had a paper addressing that just recently as well. But I found it very important to be a part of that. I had the very fortunate to be president of that organization for 2 years, et cetera, and I'm probably the longest active member in the organization as well. But bottom line is, going back to original, these professional organizations are important for you. Set aside even that what I call that networking situation. I think it's really important for them to learn, to grow, and experience what others are doing as well, because it can provide a forum for discussions and debates about appropriate directions to go.
What advice do you have for prospective planners, emerging planners, or even more seasoned planners in terms of their career development?
A couple maybe buzzwords. Flexibility and adaptability. I think if just listening to what I've just sort of summarized as some of my projects, they evolved over time. The issues evolved over time as well. So you may be headed down a particular direction and responding to a particular issue. You may need to change that direction. And again, what I mentioned about things necessarily don't work that you may identify as a strategy as to. So emerging planners, I think, you come out of school and you've had your education, and you really get your feet wet in your first job about what planning really is. And it may not be what you really thought it was when you were in school as well. And so you need to be nimble and fast on your feet to be able to think about how do I'm going to adapt to indeed what I'm now learning from the real world, and is that a role I want to have as well. So flexibility, but flexibility then in terms of content. As I said, we did talk about placemaking 30 years ago in our planning documents, et cetera. But that grew from a discussion with the community about what they wanted their community to be. And so we asked the question in that community in West Hollywood in particular about what kind of places, pedestrian, we want places where people can gather, we want active street life, et cetera. That grew then to solutions like the pedestrian ordinance that had not been on the books before as well. So I think there's very critical for planners to understand it's not just you as a profession, but how you interact with the public to listen to what they're saying, and then how you respond to their ideas, but also provide the opportunity to educate the community. I mean, we had communities totally reacted negatively to like mixed-use development, but when we explored what mixed use could really be, said, yeah, that may be nice. So the notion of being adaptable and flexible over time. Also, don't fear being innovative and creative. Be willing to think out of the box. You don't have to go to this box of strategies and this checklist of things and solutions for this. Well, one of the things I've always felt important for when we write general plans, and I've seen many general plans that you rip off the name of the city or the community, which it is, and hey, it seems to be, I've read that this other general plan. I won't name some of those plans, I said, or the consultants who have been responsible, because that's still happening out there as well. Custom crafting, understanding the place you're working and understanding the issues and who they really are, I think is really important for planners to be thinking about as they move into this planning. Is don't rely upon the same old, but be willing to think, understand the place, and be willing to say, okay, maybe there's something else, some other way that maybe this isn't, I don't need to have to do what this other city has done, but I will be willing to think and explore other options.
Woodie, where would you like to see the field of planning go next?
Fundamentally, I think we in planning don't have our sights as firmly as it should be on implementation. I think there are examples, and I've just given you some project examples where it has been as well. But I think so many of our projects become paper projects. I had far more clients who was really interested in basically making sure that all the paperwork is done. They have to create a planning document. It has to have these elements per state law, et cetera. And it's completed, and then it basically sits on the shelf. So the ability to indeed take that document the planners work on, the next step, and make it real. That's why I mentioned about monitoring, because some of the things you may write in the general plan may become really moot. You need to create plans that are more dynamic and changeable over time, not locked in stone. I had one client basically at one point in time said, after a rather exhaustive public process, we're going to lock this general plan in stone forever. But within months, there was a particular project up and it was being proposed, and a developer where they learned that the project just wasn't physically feasible given what was in the plan to carry forward. And that council member said, I think we need to amend our general plan, et cetera, based upon this. So I think we need to be really focused upon not just creating paper documents, but we need to be focused upon creating, and that's the way, not just on planning documents, but take planning more broadly. You're in affordable housing. So you're not creating just approval process, you're creating an approval process to lead you to people living within those buildings and indeed levels of affordability, et cetera. So I think if we orient what we do even at the most general level on things like general plans to more action-oriented kinds of strategies like we do, like implementing, transit-oriented plans or, affordable housing or sustainability, we need to be mindful about, okay, what is it going to take to do it? Who's responsible? How long is it going to take? And realistically, how we're going to fund this, how we're going to make it move forward.
I do appreciate your point about implementation and evaluating such implementation on planners' projects. I think depending on the sector that you're in or the phase of the project that you're working on, sometimes it's really easy to lose sight of the final product. So it really is important to come back and evaluate the implementation and review what has worked and what hasn't worked in the future so that we can ensure that we are continuing to refine our planning process for the best interest of the community. And with that, I do want to thank you, Woodie, for your time today. I really appreciated learning more about you in this interview. I know we are both passionate planners, so we can probably continue this conversation for a much longer time, but I do thank you again for coming in.
Glad to hear about your passion. I think I would say probably the one other word I didn't use here, passion is absolutely very important. Again, as we said at the outset about me, I'm continuing because I love what I do. And I'm not giving up the teaching at the USC. Students, don't be fearful. I basically think that a planner, if they're really going to lead to that implementation, needs to have that passion because they really care about what they're being done. So I'm glad to hear you say that.
Thank you again, Woodie, for taking the time to sit down and have a conversation with me today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to join in the conversation with you today.